missing the really huge hiding in plain sight secret, which is that I wasn't my father's biological child. And I didn't find that out until midlife, until 4 years ago. And I found out randomly and accidentally by taking a home DNA test as someone who has spent my whole adult life untangling secrets, both in my fiction and in my memoirs, thinking about the corrosive power of secrets and what secrets do to us. This was a huge thing to find out that I was the secret.
Dear Family is a podcast hosted by Rachel Steinman, a writer, an educator, and a mental health advocate. And Rachel gets us up close and personal, so we feel a strong connection, familiarity, and comfort with her guests. So settle in and join us as we search for true healing and journey with Rachel and her most interesting guests.
Hello, dear family listeners. This is Rachel Steinman, and I am so thrilled to bring you another episode of the Dear Family podcast. I hope you had a great Labor Day weekend. I cannot believe that I am sharing my 56th episode with you. And one of the incredible things about this podcasting journey is that I have the opportunity to speak with incredible people one-on-one. This week will not disappoint. I got to sit face-to-face on Zoom and look eye to eye with my writing idol and my podcasting idol. I am so grateful. She truly is a gem. And for those of you that don't know Dani Shapiro, which I'm kind of surprised if you don't, you are going to be blown away by her incredible insight. Make sure to stay tuned. Thank you so much for writing those 5-star reviews. And for those of you that don't have time to write those 5-star reviews, just clicking that 5-star on Apple Podcasts is so helpful and really helps me grow and move up the charts. And of course, word of mouth is fantastic. So share with your friends and family. And follow me on all the social media platforms at Right Now Rachel. That's right with a W. Dani Shapiro is a national treasure, and to anyone who loves memoir, she reigns supreme. Dani has a way with words and a way of moving you to stop everything and consider, what is it that makes you who you are? I can honestly say she's been a guiding light for me when it comes to writing and podcasting. Whether fiction or nonfiction, her writing examines our memory and history, biology, experience, our spirit, and our souls. Dani has spent her entire life questioning who she was, a single child growing up in an Orthodox Jewish community. After 4 memoirs and 5 novels that always revolved around family secrets and identity, she discovers midlife that she's not who she thought she was. After a paternity test proves her beloved father, an Orthodox Jew who never looked anything like her blonde self, was not in fact her biological father, she questions everything she knows. Today, we delve deep into why family secrets are so incredibly harmful as we discuss her New York Times bestselling memoir, Inheritance, a most masterful work. Besides being the author of multiple bestselling books, Dani is also an essayist and a journalist whose short fiction, essays, and journalistic pieces have appeared in The New Yorker, Elle, Vogue, the Oprah Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, the op-ed pages of the New York Times, and so many more. She's taught in the writing programs at Columbia, NYU, the New School, and Wesleyan University. She is the co-founder of the Sirenland Writers Conference in Positano, Italy, a conference high up on my bucket list. Recently, Dani launched 2 riveting podcasts. She's the host of the hit podcast Family Secrets and The Way We Live Now, which is a look at how others are dealing with the pandemic. Dani lives with her family in Litchfield County, Connecticut. It truly was my honor to speak one-on-one with one of my writing and podcasting idols. She does not disappoint, as she moved me to my core and made me think deeply, like the seasoned storyteller she is, and I know she will move you as well. It's so nice to meet you. Welcome, Dani. I really do feel like I know you from all the books I've read of yours, and I've just listened to all your podcasts. And I'm really honored that you're here. I want to start by thanking a mutual friend of ours, Ben King, who you know through your husband because they've worked together. Ben has referred to you as an angel on earth, and I think that's so sweet. I totally agree with that sentiment. We've never spoken. I feel like we're real kindred spirits. We both were raised Jewish, but feel more spiritual. We are both mothers and writers and teachers and now podcasters, and we practice yoga. So I love hearing your beautiful spirit. It really goes deep into my heart. Unlike you, who has written 10 books, I was a former kindergarten elementary school teacher. I am now working on my very first book, and it was quite by accident, and I can tell you about that some other time. But it was going to be titled Inherited, and it was about family secrets. And the family secrets were about 5 generations of mental health disorders that resulted in forced suicides and illicit affairs and drug abuse. And the list can go on. And I wanted to stop that generational trauma. And I was asked to be on a few podcasts, and I love the platform. And I said, you know what, I'm going to do a podcast, and I'm going to call it Family Secrets. And then your podcast came out in February of 2019, just as I was gelling and thinking about it. So then I changed my podcast to Dear Family. But I don't think it's by any accident that you have been a step ahead, or maybe many steps ahead of me, because I truly do look at you as a sage advisor, and I'm so grateful to have someone to follow.
Oh, well, that's very meaningful to me and moving and lovely. And I'm sorry about the title.
No, it's fantastic. I don't know if I believe completely in fate, but I do think that there's purpose to things. And so it really kind of shone a light on that I needed to follow you and what you do. And you definitely have that uncanny way of making me cry and touching me so deeply, like you did with your guests on your last podcast, The Way We Live Now. I would love you to tell the listeners a little bit about where you're recording.
Oh, I love having the tables turned. That's fun. At this very moment that we're having this conversation, I'm in my little office on the second floor of my home in Litchfield County, Connecticut, which is very much the countryside of Connecticut. It's rural. It's not what people think of. I think of suburban Connecticut and John Cheever country. If I look out my window, I see meadow. There are several people in my backyard right now building a stone patio. So you won't hear the banging, but there's lots of activity going on outside our house. My dog is asleep on the floor of my office, and my son, who's been home with us since the beginning of the pandemic, is reading in my room, where he likes the comfortable chair in my bedroom. And I'm surrounded by family photos, by bulletin boards that have things that are tacked to them that are meaningful to me, and lots and lots and lots of books.
Yes. And it's lovely. I get to see you via Zoom, and I definitely see all those books, which look well loved. Because this is a podcast called Dear Family, I always love to start by asking you to tell us a little about yourself and your family.
I'll start actually with my family today, and then I'll tell you about where I come from. My closest family is my husband, Michael, who I've been married to for 22 years. And our son, Jacob, who's 21. Michael is a filmmaker, a writer-director, and he used to be a foreign correspondent before we met. He was based in Africa. And Jacob's a college student. And we have a very close-knit, very loving, very tight family where really there are no secrets. It was something that was very important to me. I don't know that I could have articulated it or said it to you, like when I was pregnant or when Jacob was little, that I really never wanted to ever lie to him. The only lie I've ever told him was that he was a really picky eater. And we were in Italy one year, and he wouldn't eat anything that wasn't basically a chicken finger in disguise. And I had ordered veal milanese, and I told him it was chicken. That's literally the only lie I can think of ever having told him.
And I can tell you still feel a little guilty about it.
Yeah, he knows now. And same with my husband. I wouldn't say we're open books to each other, but we know what's going on with each other, and we always have. And that is something that's so important to me because I grew up in a family that was laden with secrets. I clearly knew that. I was always digging and snooping and looking through my mother's things and looking through my father's things and trying to figure out what I didn't know. And even in my early books, I write about growing up in a house full of secrets and knowing that there was something that I couldn't quite get at, but I didn't know what it was. In my childhood and in my teenage years and then early in my life as a writer, I kept on supplying narratives for why my father seemed so unhappy or why my mother seemed so brittle. It turns out that all of those narratives were true. Everything that I thought was secret, but I was missing the really huge hiding in plain sight secret, which is what my most recent book, Inheritance, is about, which is that I wasn't my father's biological child. And I didn't find that out until midlife, until 4 years ago. And I found out randomly and accidentally by taking a home DNA test just as a lark.
Wow. You grew up modern Orthodox in New Jersey, and you were an only child, and your father was very religious, but your mother was atheist, but followed along with your father. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was not a first marriage for either of them. They were older when they met. I think the condition of their courtship and certainly of their marriage was that my father was committed to living an observant life and having an observant home. And my mother was Jewish, but not religious, and she was later described to me as an atheist. But she agreed to that condition, and to the condition also that if they had children, which they certainly planned to do, that those children would be raised observant. So yes, modern Orthodox, which is of course different from the black hat Orthodox. I have many relatives who are black hatters on my father's side.
So fascinating, really. And when you left home and you went away to college, you rebelled against that upbringing and you started doing things like eating bacon, those types of things that to someone that is not Orthodox Jewish doesn't see that as a rebellion. So much of your books are about identity, and here you are rebelling against how you were brought up. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And was that when you started experimenting with drugs or alcohol?
That's a great question. I was raised in such a strict way that there was nowhere to go. There was no path presented to me other than to marry an Orthodox man and have an Orthodox family. That was something that I really was never going to do. I can't think back to a time in my childhood or in my teenage years where I really thought that that was going to be my future. I loved my father and I loved his connection to his religion because it was a huge part of him. By the way, if you're hearing kind of purring behind me, that's my dog who thinks he's a cat.
I don't, but I love that your dog purrs.
Okay, he's just purring. So when I started, and also my parents were in conflict with each other, and I had the sense that my mother was really chafing against all of the rules. For listeners who don't know what some of the rules were, we were Sabbath observant, which meant that from sundown on Friday night to sundown on Saturday night, we didn't drive, use electricity, couldn't ride my bike, I couldn't do homework, I couldn't write, I couldn't play the piano.
Use money.
Couldn't use money, couldn't hang out with my friends. And we also had a kosher home, strictly kosher, with 2 sinks and 2 dishwashers, one for dairy and one for meat. We didn't mix the two. And then, of course, the prohibitions against anything that's pork or anything that's shellfish, mixing dairy with meat, etc. And then every holiday, and there are many holidays. I mean, there are obscure holidays. There are so many Jewish holidays. And my father was a Wall Street stockbroker, and he took off every single Jewish holiday. And he was known on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange where he worked as the rabbi. And so when I was a teenager, I remember eating bacon for the first time and thinking that God was going to strike me dead. It just was such a transgression. And I was a good girl, and I wasn't at that point experimenting with anything else like cigarettes or pot or alcohol, any of that. But it was such a big deal to be eating what I wasn't supposed to eat or driving in a car on the Sabbath. So when I got to college and the gates were sort of lifted, I basically just was like a spinning top, spinning in every possible direction and not knowing really who I was deep inside, what I could possibly do with my life. And I started doing drugs, I started drinking, smoked a lot of cigarettes, and wasn't really academically in a position to take advantage of the great education that was being offered me.
Where were you?
I was at Sarah Lawrence. Mm-hmm. It was a really dark time. I would say from about 16, 17 till I was 23. I think really one that I could have easily not survived. I think about that time a lot, especially now, because I didn't have a spiritual life. I didn't think you could have a spiritual life without having a religious life. And by religious life, I mean an Orthodox Jewish life. I now know that that is absolutely possible, but I didn't know that it was possible then. I also had this sense of my own otherness. You mentioned identity. Well, I was told all my life that I didn't look Jewish. I was told all my life, in one way or another, are you sure? You don't really seem like you belong. And it was pretty much said outright, which is amazing to me. I think in terms of identity politics today, we know better than to say to somebody, you don't look like who you say you are. But these were mostly comments that were coming to me from other Jewish people. And I've got to say, and this may tick some people off a little bit, but that still happens. I don't mean with me. I mean generally. In the Jewish world, that is somehow considered to be a compliment to say to somebody, you don't look Jewish. I mean, I'm blonde, I'm blue-eyed. It was always like, oh, you could have passed. And it always really offended me and bothered me and confused me. But you know what, Rachel? It was true. I really don't look in a way Semitic. I look like I come from another part of the world. And that is what people were commenting on. So my very own physical appearance was confusing. My reflection in the mirror was confusing. The way that people responded to me was confusing. And it was only really in very recent years that it stopped being confusing and that the lights blinked on and I came to understand how that was the case. But that period of time, that rebellion was very real and very big and very hard to understand for a long time, because that is really not what I'm made of. And I don't think it was what I was made of then. It was like I was trying on another identity, like I was forcing myself to be a certain way.
When you're 16 to 23 and you have a son who's in that age range, and I have a daughter that's almost 15 and one that's almost 18, that's the time when you are figuring out your identity. So to feel other and then leave your parents, it's got to be incredibly confusing. I want to discuss how your father, who you adored and looked up to and was this very sage man, died in a car crash when you were just 23 years old. And your mom was severely injured and you had to become your mom's caretaker. This was at a time that you also admit at the end of this kind of identity crisis where you were feeling a bit like a mess. And in writing terms, it's what we call a mwek, or the moment when everything changed. You've described it as something that was so terrible that turned your life around. Can you tell us, how did it turn your life around?
I think I was a young woman on a path that wasn't leading anywhere of my own volition. I was chosen by the terrible boyfriend that I was with. I was, in fact, stalked by him until I finally just gave in. And I was acting, and I'm making quote marks with my fingers when I say that, in television commercials because somebody said, oh, you can do this. And so I was doing it even though I felt like I was wearing the wrong size shoes, like nothing fit about me. And it was the mid-'80s. It was a time of so much excess in New York City, a terrible decade to come of age, really, in terms of like what people's values were and what we thought was important. And when my parents were in their accident and I lost my father and my mother was so badly injured and I was their only child. And my family, because there was so much bad blood between my father's family and my mother's family, my family really fractured and no one was thinking about me. I had no adults in my life. I thought about that a lot recently because during this time of the pandemic, I had the really strange experience of recording the audiobook for Slow Motion. There had never been an audiobook. Slow Motion came out in 1998. Audiobooks weren't really a thing. So I had the experience of going into this tiny little booth for days on end as a woman in my 50s, revisiting myself in my early 30s, writing about myself at that time as a child, a teenager, and in my early 20s. It was a very magical and also very startling experience because I realized that I am closer to the age that my parents were when they were in their car accident. My husband is the age that my father was when he died. And my son is close to the age that I was when all this happened to me. And it gave me these huge new stores of empathy and compassion for myself at that age, because I thought about my kid who is in much better shape than I was at that age. And I thought of what if, God forbid, something happened to my husband and me, the way that our family, my husband's family, my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law, would swoop in to take care of this young man. No one did that for me. They did the opposite. And there's a moment in slow motion where my father's family decides to sit Shiva for my father in New York City at my grandmother's apartment. And my mother was like very nearly on her own deathbed at a hospital in New Jersey. So what they were really doing was making me, at the age of 23, make a choose to grieve my father in the Jewish tradition and be with my family, my relatives, and go through the process of sitting Shiva, which is such a important thing to be able to do, or be with my mother who needed me. And I spent that week with my mother. But looking back at it now, I have so much more clarity about all that than I did then. And so you ask about the shock to my system. The feeling for me was, who are you going to be now? Who are you going to be at this moment? We never know who we're going to be when the shit hits the fan. We never know who we're going to be if there's an earthquake or a fire or an assault and there's something that we can do about it. We never know until we are. It was truly a kind of life or death moment for me too. The person that I was meant to become was hanging in the balance. And I began to, I hate the word heal, but I did. I began to heal. I took care of my mother for that year. I went back to college. I dropped out. I went back with a vengeance. I went back with a sense of purpose. And I quit drinking, and I quit drugs, and I quit smoking cigarettes, and I quit the bad boyfriend. And I didn't do that all in like one day, but I did all that. And it was really the way that I've described it. It was like a shock to my system, and my system needed shocking. It shocked me out of where I had been and into this being that I think I had always been, but had moved away from.
I think that offers a lot of hope to people who think that sometimes when they hit real lows, that it's going to continue to be spiraling downward. And sometimes, as you said, those words shock to your system. It forces you to put something in action. And how fascinating to read something you wrote up so much earlier. I'm sure as a writer, you wanted to get your pen out and edit left and right, because I've only just started writing about 5 years ago. And I look back and I go, oh my God, wow, that needs some editing.
I was actually once in a while saying I had a director on my headphones and a sound engineer. And I would say to the director, can I leave that word out? You know, I'd like to adverb way too much. And he's like, author's prerogative. And it's excellent.
Oh, nice.
So the audio version is ever so slightly tweaked by me all these years and all these books later.
That's great. I love that. You've written 5 memoirs and 5 novels, and whether they're fiction or nonfiction, they really do revolve around family secrets, which is fascinating that this 10th memoir, whether you want to call it divine intervention, it really is one of the ultimate family secrets about finding out your dad, who you loved, was not your biological father. I think it's not a coincidence that you are this sage advisor to help so many people going through the same issue as you, because you just have a way to put things into perspective. You grew up in an Orthodox community where you were that blonde child who became the Kodak Christmas poster child, a fact that your parents were very proud of. Do you remember your parents reacting to that comment when people would say, oh, your daughter doesn't look Jewish? Do you ever remember their reactions?
That's such a good question. I've tried to call that back to mind because that had to be so loaded for them every time somebody said that, and people said it constantly. I really don't remember either of them having any reaction. My mother would react sometimes when people would talk about my being an only child, because in suburban New Jersey in the 1960s and 1970s, there weren't a lot of only children. I mean, really, if you just lay it all out, this child, her parents are older, she's an only child, she doesn't look anything like them. When Inheritance was coming out and people started knowing what it was about, my high school English teacher's wife wrote a comment on a Facebook post of mine, and it was #always wondered. So
Right.
I think if people had no skin in the game and they actually were just looking at the cold hard facts, they very well might have thought that I might be adopted. I'm sure people talked about that, but not for a single solitary second was that ever something that I thought. My mother would say, I may only have one, but I hit the jackpot. That was her line. And I heard it many times. I can hear it in her voice right now, saying it in my ears, but never a reaction to that I didn't look.
And it's funny because in this day and age where family secrets are being exposed left and right, I think it would have probably been called out. Your recent book, which is a New York Times bestseller, which I absolutely loved listening to the audiobook, Inheritance, a memoir of genealogy, paternity, and love. And by the way, I listened to it and drove around LA and stayed in my car. I couldn't get out of my car. It was that good. This was pre-pandemic. It begins with you having your DNA analyzed through Ancestry.com and finding out that your beloved father was not your biological father and that your DNA results were 53% Ashkenazi Jewish. And just a little personal anecdote, I had my DNA done through 23andMe and it came back 99.9% Ashkenazi Jewish. And I'm even more Ashkenazi Jewish than my husband, who's a lineage of rabbis. But I really thought that I was going to come back and have some genetic diversity, which my daughters are kind of bummed that there's zero diversity in their blood pool. But because my mom grew up with a Christmas tree, my mom grew up with her parents kind of denying their religion and naming their kids Bobby and Johnny, doing the kind of antithesis of Jewish things. I think it's also fascinating that in this day and age, my blood is 99%. That's a whole other thing. But anyways, one of the things that I thought was so interesting, and I heard you talk about this, is that there's 2% of DNA tests come back with NPE, which stands for not parent expected. And you also mentioned that nobody talked about fertility issues in the 60s. And when they did, it was usually assumed that it was the mother's fertility that was having problems. And your mom was almost 40 in 1961. So they would have probably assumed it was your mom. Was sperm donation, was there ever any mention about that when you were growing up?
Sperm donation? I mean, absolutely not. There was no sense that there was anything unusual about my conception at all. When my results came back and they didn't make sense to me, and when I, through a series of steps, came to realize in what felt initially really crushing and shocking that my father had not been my biological father, my mind very quickly went to a couple of clues that if I had not had, I just simply would have never known. And just as a side note, I have such compassion for the many, many people out there who end up making one of these discoveries. And there are many people. That 2% NPE, well, millions of people take the test every year. So if you do the math, hundreds of thousands of people each year are making these discoveries. They often end up in the dark, never being able to piece together the fundamental story of their own identity. We don't walk around generally thinking, how'd I get here? We know. Or if we're adopted, we know we don't know because we've been told that. And I'm not making light of that. That's hard. But we know whatever the facts are that are to know. And our identities are formed by the stories that we're told about ourselves. We believe them. Why wouldn't we? There were a couple of clues. One of the clues, I could date it. It was February 23rd, 1988. I knew the date because my father had died on February 23rd, 1986. So it was the second anniversary of his death. And I was back on track in my life. And I was in graduate school at this point at Sarah Lawrence College, where I had also done my undergraduate. And I was in the writing program. I was trying to write a first novel about a lot of the stuff that had happened. And there was a reading on that evening. And I didn't want my mother to spend the evening alone because it was the second anniversary of my dad's death. So I brought her with me to Sarah Lawrence. So it was a drive out of New York City, about a half an hour. I picked her up. I brought her there. And we were milling around with some of the other students and faculty. And I introduced my mother to a classmate of mine named Rachel, actually. And my mother said, "Oh, Rachel, nice to meet you. Where are you from?" And Rachel said, "I'm from Philadelphia." And my mother said, without missing a beat, "Oh, my daughter was conceived in Philadelphia." And I'm standing there and I've never heard that. And I'm 25 years old. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? It's such a weird thing to say. I said, "Mom, what do you mean?" And she said, "Oh, it's not a pretty story." That really got my attention and also tells you a lot about the way my mother communicated. And on the way back to the city after the reading, I had her as my captive in my car for half an hour. And I started asking her questions. "What do you mean I was conceived in Philadelphia? What do you mean it's not a pretty story? You can't just leave it at that." And she said, "Well, your father and I were having trouble conceiving, and we went to an institute," and that was the word she used, institute, in Philadelphia. "And I would call your father at the moment that they would be able to ID exactly when I was ovulating," which was cutting edge science in those days. "And he would come racing down from the city to Philadelphia so that we could do the procedure." And I'm driving along and I say, "What procedure was that, Mom?" And she said, "Artificial insemination." Okay, so that is a weird and strange fact to find out about one's own conception at the age of 25, but not that weird. It just meant that they used my father's sperm, and that's how they ended up being able to have me. So I metabolized that, took that in. But that night, or maybe the next day, I called. My father had a child from his first marriage. It was a much older half-sister of mine, which is another reason I never would have thought. So I called my half-sister, Susie, and I asked if she had known anything about fertility problems. And what Susie responded was, "No, I didn't really know anything about that, but I do know something about reproductive medicine in those days. And you might want to look into that further, because there used to be a practice at that time where if they were doing artificial insemination because the man was either infertile or had subfertile sperm, they would mix donor sperm with the intended father's sperm. Mixed sperm. That actually, I later found out recently, had a clinical name, which was confused artificial insemination. My conviction that my dad was so strong that I basically thought, my sister and I didn't really get along all that well. And I really thought, oh, please, wouldn't you love that to be the case? Then you'd have dad all for yourself. I just made light of it. But I did go back and ask my mother. I said, I heard that this was something that was done in those days. And my mother, again, without blinking, said, absolutely not. Can you imagine such a thing? That never would have happened. Your father never would have agreed to that. And with great relief, at the age of 25 in 1988, I thought, yeah, that's right. He never would have agreed to that. And I shut the door. I shut it. And that door remained sealed shut. I never, ever thought about it again until that evening a few years ago when the results came back. And I knew it meant my mother didn't have an affair. I knew it meant that my biological father must have been a sperm donor. That was the beginning for me of unraveling so many mysteries. The deepest mystery for me, people often think that the deepest mystery must have been, well, who was my biological father? And yes, that was something I really wanted to know and found out. And again, there are no spoilers in this book. It's got nothing to do with the what. It's all about the why and the who. The deeper mystery was, did my parents lie to me? Did my parents spend my life holding this secret consciously? Did my father, and I know how much he loved me, I believe with all my being that it made no difference to him. But did he know? Or did the Institute fool my parents, lie to my parents, just want to have their success rates be high? Or did my mother know and lie to my father? My mind was just a swirl with what really happened? What is the story literally of my life? How have I come to be? And as someone who has spent my whole adult life untangling secrets, both in my fiction and in my memoirs, thinking about the corrosive power of secrets and what secrets do to us, this was a huge thing to find out that I was the secret. There is a small subset of people who make discoveries like this and think, okay, all right, cool. Well, I'm in the middle of my life. I have my own family. I have my career. That's a weird thing to find out, but it doesn't really rock my world. In my experience with all of the thousands of people who I've talked to, a lot of people have their worlds rocked. My world was particularly rocked because of the very nature of the kind of thinker that I am and the writer that I am, and the way that I was always trying to figure out my parents and especially my father. And they were both gone, so I couldn't ask them.
Wow. Your parents may have thought, well, we know the egg is Jewish, which technically means you're considered a Jew in the Jewish law. Maybe your parents knew and they filed it away because they didn't want to think about it, or it could have been out of shame. It could have been religious reasons. There's all those questions swirling around. Do you think it would have been different if your dad had known early on and talked about it openly? Kids now, if there's a sperm or an egg donor, they're often told right away. Do you think your relationship would have been much different with your father?
I've thought a lot about this because initially I felt so betrayed that something as fundamental as my identity was likely withheld from me in some way. I came to feel it was such a culture of secrecy. People who were conceived using donors, even people who were adopted, were often not told. People who were conceived using donors were never told, because the whole idea was, this is our baby, no one's ever going to know about it. The parents were told to go home and forget it ever happened and not tell even their family members, not to ever tell anyone, to go to the grave with it. And people really did. And so if my parents had somehow been transparent about that when I was a child, which they never would have been, but if they had been, I think it would have devastated me, because I already felt like a unicorn. I already felt like I didn't fit in. I would have felt like I must be the only person on the entire planet where this is my story. I wouldn't have had a support system. I wouldn't have had a therapist who could have understood anything about it. The possibility that I could ever know anything about my biological father or my genetics would have been impossible, out of the question. I think that it would have been very harmful to me, actually, to know as a child. But in the hundreds of events that I did when I was on tour, which I was right up until the pandemic hit, I was often approached by parents who still had not told their children, or by therapists trying to figure out what to say to their patients or their clients who were on the fence about whether to disclose to their young children, or even pregnant couples who were not sure whether they're going to disclose or not, or thinking, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And I developed a response for all of those people, because I didn't want to come from a place of, I do have a strong opinion about whether children should be told, but I wanted to come from a place that wasn't about my having a strong opinion. I wanted to say something that was unassailably true and useful and effective. And that was, they're going to find out. And so if you would like to do what I think would be, especially for adult children, your last great act of parenting, to be like, you know what, this is going to be really uncomfortable. And we need to sit down and tell you something. And you're probably going to be really upset that we never told you before, but we need to tell you. And then with young children, I just had a therapist write to me to say, she's working with a couple. When is the best time? This child is an infant. When is the best time? Today, it's understood that it should just always be part of the fabric of a child's story of beginnings, of identity. And that if it is, then it doesn't become anything toxic. It becomes simply, this is your story. The people who are really at the forefront of all this and who have done it best have been same-sex couples, because there was always going to be a third party. And so there was never a question or the possibility of keeping a secret. Or single mothers by choice. Always there was going to be somebody else. But in heterosexual couples where there is the option of, we could just never tell, there isn't that option anymore, because the popularity of DNA testing and the internet makes it really just about impossible that the truth is not going to come tumbling out because somebody in a family is going to recreationally or otherwise do one of these DNA tests. So yeah. I see those people now and I think, wow, what a remarkable development. But I really think that it is the end of the possibility that there can be family secrets.
I think that's a move in the right direction. Part of the reason I started writing and sharing so incredibly openly about my own family's illicit affairs and drug use and things that I did that I'm not proud of is because I wanted to rid that shame and shine a light and get it out in the open, and so that my daughters and I could talk about mental health issues so that there is no shame. I love your concept of your podcast about family secrets and sharing other people's stories, which, by the way, your podcast is coming back in October. I can't wait. I do think it's liberating. I'm curious to know, because you've clearly been through so much of this and had so much time to write about it and think about it and interview people, why is it so healthy to kick up that dirt and expose what sometimes is very painful?
Because it's there. Because hiding it doesn't actually make it go away. It makes it fester and contort and alter our behavior and do other things, like sort of pervert us internally in other ways, and creates ways in which we are with our children or our loved ones or our friends or in our careers. Because when there is a secret, almost always beneath that secret, the reason for the silence is shame. And the thing that happens pretty much invariably when that shame is exposed, is aired out. I don't mean exposed by other people, but when somebody decides, I'm going to tell you my story, then what happens is it connects us. I've seen this as a teacher of writing forever. When somebody is hiding something as a writer, when somebody is like, I really don't want to be open with this, so I'm going to write it as a novel. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fictionalize it. And I was like, you can write fiction, but if you fictionalize it, it's actually just not going to be alive. It's that thing. What do we most long for? We want to connect with each other. Well, we can't connect with each other if we're not telling the truth of ourselves. In recent years, that feels like my superpower, that I understand that finally. I've seen it for years as someone who teaches others, and now because of inheritance and people's stories, and because of family secrets and stories people tell on my podcast. And my podcast, at the end of every conversation, it doesn't always end up in the episode, but at the end of every conversation, I always say to my guest, are you glad you know? Whatever it is. And I have not had one single person say, no, I wish I didn't know. I'm sure that you with your daughters, me with my son, my husband and myself, the way with friendships, there is this way in which when we air that out, all that really happens is whoever we're trusting with our story, whether it's public or it's a very intimate private conversation, no matter what, the response is, oh, me too. Or if not me too exactly, me too in some way. Because we all have it. We all have versions of it. And if we don't articulate that to each other, all that does is keep us in our own little silos.
I so agree with you. It's also kind of like a weight off your chest, an unburdening, a lightness. To me, feels like it goes along with forgiveness. And forgiveness is that weight lifted and that unburdening. You talked about compassion for your younger self when you were reading. I think that this helps us find not just compassion for others, but also for ourselves. That's what my journey has taught me. I have heard you speak about how you think that this is a time of openness, and I'm always looking for silver linings, and I love that about the internet age. I do think our privacy needs to be guarded, but I also really do love that people are talking more openly. You went from being an only child to discovering that you have 3 half siblings, and potentially there could be other people out there that are also related to you as far as siblings are concerned. You did, in fact, get to meet your biological father, who looks like your son. You can see some of that familiarity. Very strongly. Did you immediately feel that familial feeling, or did it feel like any other relationship that you had to work to get to know?
I would say it's unlike any relationship that I've ever had or could imagine having, because when I met my biological father, which is how I think of him, I call my dad, and I call the man that I refer to as Ben Walden in Inheritance my biological father. I don't think of him as my sperm donor. I don't have cute names for him the way some donor conceived people do, like they call him a bio dad. It's like he's not a cartoon character. He's my biological father. And when I met him, he was very, very familiar to me. It wasn't just a physical thing. I don't really resemble my mother, and I didn't resemble my father. I never had that thing that people raised in biological families have of the familiar in each other, in physical traits or behavioral traits. We take that for granted when we're raised in biological families. We never think about it. Or if we're raised in a non-biological family, we know that we don't have that. I was always looking for it, never saw it. And then suddenly I'm sitting across the table from this man who absolutely I come from. And then much more subtle things. There's a lot of my nature that comes from him. Ironically, I favored him biologically. I'm much more like him than I am like my mother. I'm also quite a lot like my father who raised me. I'm not dismissing nurture at all. I feel like I come from 3 people. But in terms of my biological father, seeing that familiarity in a complete stranger who lives in a different part of the country, has a completely different history, has completely different ancestors than the ancestors that I believed myself to have, from a different story. His ancestors are settlers of the United States. They came over on the Mayflower. I grew up with my ancestors are from the shtetl. So what do you do with that? So very, very intensely familiar and yet not known. My 3 half siblings are his kids. I haven't discovered any half siblings from his having donated sperm, which is really unusual. And I don't think about it. If somebody turns up, somebody turns up. If they don't, they don't. But I certainly am not going to have the story that a lot of people in my position do, which is scores of half siblings, which is its own weirdness. Like a friend that I've made in this world who has discovered something like 47, half siblings. Yeah, it's so weird. Like,
wow.
What do you do with that? We weren't meant to have to process that. But in terms of his kids, he has a daughter and we're friends. I don't have the same feeling of familiarity. I have some, but I don't have the same sense of familiarity with her. And I don't particularly with my biological half brothers. And I've met one of them very briefly and not the other. And I don't think about that either.
Has Jacob met Ben?
That is something that I've made Ben a promise not to talk about.
Oh, I understand. Makes
in other words,
sense.
Like I talk about anything that I wrote about in Inheritance. I think it's worth saying. I made this discovery. I found the man who was, as a young medical student, donated sperm. I basically wrote him an email and said, "Hi, I think I'm your biological daughter." And he ultimately did the very kind and noble thing by being willing to engage with me, not ghosting me, not slamming the door in my face. I've heard terrible, difficult stories. And then I went on and wrote a best-selling book and was on TV and radio and, movies in the works. I wanted to say to him and to his family, moving forward, we have our own relationship, whatever it is. I'm not going to be writing more about it. I'm not going to be talking about what happened beyond the pages of Inheritance.
And I totally respect that. I have teenage daughters that don't want me talking about their private lives. And yet here I am on a podcast called Dear Family. And as a memoirist, the difficult line of walking. By the way, for the listeners that are hearing, that's Dani's dog making really cute sounds. It's not our tummies grumbling. Just a few more questions. Your husband, Michael, who I follow on Instagram, thanks to Ben, was a war correspondent in Africa, and he's written for Rolling Stones and Time, and he's also a filmmaker. He can also add cancer survivor to his list, and he shared it beautifully and very openly on his Instagram stories. I can speak for myself as a newly minted writer. I'm always taking notes now for future ideas or essays. As you were going through this, were you also cataloging? Is there something in the works?
It's a great question, actually. I think it's my nature as a writer to always be taking notes because it's how I come to understand anything, whether I end up writing about it or not. I have to capture it in language to understand it. And so, yes, during the period of time that Michael was ill and was in treatment, I wasn't writing per se. And I was also still on book tour. So I was taking care of my very sick husband and very, very terrified, and was in the midst of having a big best-selling book, which you don't walk away from because it doesn't necessarily ever happen again. And I'm a working writer. So it was everything. There was a lot going on.
Highs and lows.
The highs and lows all at once. My practice is to scribble things down on index cards and to just write just enough so that I'll be able to capture. Yeah. For the listener, you're showing me, we're looking at each other on Zoom and you're just showing me your index. It's a great, for me, it's a great practice because it allows me to take notes without forming a narrative yet before I know what it is. What I thought the story was how to contend with the beauty and the terror all at once. And I did start writing about that once Michael was pronounced cancer-free. But then the pandemic hit. And the one thing that I'll say, because I'm sure there are writers who are listening, is I wrote about this a little bit in Inheritance too. It is impossible to create narrative directly out of trauma. I think poets can do it because they're not creating narrative per se. I've written hundreds of pages since being home in isolation and social distance and quarantine with my family. And I've thrown away hundreds of pages because the present is shifting for all of us right now. We don't know what this is. We don't know what it means. We don't know when or if it will end. We don't know what the world is going to look like on the other side of it. We don't even know what we're doing in September or October or for Christmas, or will we go anywhere? Will we go into offices? My husband was 5 days away from finishing a movie that Ben King has a major role in, and they had to shut down 5 days before finishing. When will they be able to finish those 5 days? They will finish, but when will they finish? So many unknowns, and to write from that place is something that I'm thinking about a lot.
Yeah.
But I've also had to allow myself to be in a place of waiting and patience and soaking it in and reading and thinking. And I've been producing the 4th season of Family Secrets, so that's been a great creative outlet for me. I love doing that. So thank goodness for that. But yes, I did take notes, but now that period of time feels a bit like it's in a time capsule. I can only write about it from now. Last year at this time, I was trembling. This year at this time, the whole world is trembling.
For the listeners that don't know, Dani is also a teacher that's taught at Columbia, and she does writing retreats in beautiful Positano, which is on my bucket list dream. I hope to join you sometime. That is really an interesting thing to think about, how you need kind of some time and space to write a narrative. This question I ask every guest. So Jacob is 21. If you could write your 21-year-old self a Dear Dani love letter, knowing everything that you know now, what advice would you give?
I love that question, and I give that sometimes as an assignment when I'm leading retreats. Don't sell yourself short. What you see in front of you right now is anything but the whole picture. Tend to your dreams, know what they are, and you be the chooser. You be the chooser of your destiny. You be the chooser of your mate. You be the chooser of your path forward.
I love that. You talked about how when you were lost and you went off to school, that's exactly what you weren't doing.
Yeah. So, spinning top. And then you're always in a place of reactivity, reacting rather than acting.
Dani, what brings you happiness? Do you have any happiness habits?
I meditate for 20 minutes every morning. I have a whole ritual surrounding it. I don't know that it brings me exactly happiness, but it gives me space inside of myself for happiness to bloom. It's a real practice where every morning I sit down. I always Instagram a picture of my crystal that I meditate with to remind other people about meditation. I have a yoga practice, and it's been really interesting during the pandemic because I never liked doing online classes, and now I have found one teacher in particular. Her name is Mary Beth LaRue. She's actually in LA, in Silver Lake, and I love her Zoom classes. Sometimes I do them live. Sometimes I do them later because they're recorded. But that brings me happiness and inner spaciousness. Lastly, this is kind of corny, but I'm home with my family. I still had so much traveling to do. when this hit, I got so good at packing a suitcase and packing my cute outfits and my curling iron and my makeup and my crystals and my everything and just hitting the road, airplane, every other day. And I was supposed to be in Paris and Sydney and all over the country. And being home this spring, I realized, oh, this is when my peonies bloom. I hadn't seen my peonies bloom. I hadn't been home for them in years. Oh, this is when the wisteria starts to bloom. This is what the trees look like when they start to redden, when it becomes spring. Inhabiting our home and being with my family with this level of togetherness. My son is 21. We wouldn't have been sitting down to dinner most nights together as a family. No way. And it's been really special and beautiful. And so every night when I'm cooking dinner and playing music in my kitchen and knowing that I'm going to sit down with my family, that brings me happiness.
And that is the definition of happiness, which is to slow down and be in the moment and notice the colors of nature and count your blessings. So it sounds like that slowing down was really a positive. I'm so excited for Family Secrets to come back out again. And I'm so grateful to have spent this time with you. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Oh, I so enjoyed it. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. And keep inspiring us. I know you're going to. Bye, Dani.
Bye, Rachel.
Bye. Thank you. This is Rachel Steinman. For more information or to contact me with any questions, comments, or guest ideas, please check out rightnowrachel.com. That's right with a W. Thank you so much for listening, subscribing, and sharing, dear family. And if you found value in what you've just heard, I would love and so appreciate a great review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, I wish you love, happiness, and good mental health.